Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you've been following this series, you know the drill. I moved to the UK thinking I was coming from the land of innovation. I thought America was the place that invented the modern world, and Britain was just the place that invented, I don't know, queues and apologizing. But for the last 2 years, I have been getting absolutely schooled by history plaques, museum docents, and smug British friends at the pub. And honestly, I'm not even mad anymore, I'm just impressed and maybe a little bit embarrassed for our education system. So let's get into it. Here is part 3 of American inventions that Britain actually did first. 1. The suburban lawn and the lawnmower. Okay, let's start with the ultimate symbol of the American dream. Picture it. It's a Saturday morning in the suburbs. You're in Ohio or New Jersey. Dad is out there in his white New Balance sneakers, pushing a machine across a carpet of green velvet. The smell of cut grass is in the air. We treat the lawn like a civic religion in the US. We have homeowners associations that will literally sue you if your grass is half an inch too tall. It feels like the most American concept ever. Man conquering nature to create a perfect privatized paradise. I assumed the lawnmower was invented by someone like John Deere or maybe a guy named Skip in a garage in the 1950s. But no, the reason we have lawns and the machine that makes them possible is entirely British. And the story is actually kind of wild. Before the 1830s, if you wanted a lawn, you had to be incredibly rich. Why? Because the only way to keep grass short was to pay a team of men with scythes, those grim reaper-looking blades, to manually slice the grass all day long. Or you let sheep graze on it, which meant poop everywhere. It wasn't practical for a regular house. Enter a guy named Edwin Beard Budding. He was an engineer from Gloucestershire, England. In 1830, he was working in a textile mill, which is very British industrial revolution of him. He saw a machine that was used to trim the nap off of velvet cloth. It was a cylinder with blades that spun around against a cutting bar. Budding had a light bulb moment. He thought, if this can trim velvet, why can't it trim grass? He built the first machine, but he was actually terrified to test it during the day because he thought his neighbors would think he was a lunatic for trying to push a mechanical contraption over the grass. So he tested it at night. Imagine looking out your window in 1830s England and seeing a guy pushing a loud, clanking metal box in the moonlight. You'd think he was a grave robber. He patented it in 1830. And here is the cultural shift that America forgets. The lawnmower democratized the lawn. Because of Budding, you didn't need a team of servants or a flock of sheep. You just needed one machine. This allowed the British middle class to start having gardens with grass, and that aesthetic eventually traveled across the ocean to the US, where we took it, injected it with steroids, and turned it into the suburban obsession we have today. So every time you smell that fresh cut grass in the summer, you are literally smelling the legacy of a British textile engineer who was too shy to mow his lawn during the day. 2. The subway. Now, I need to speak to my New Yorkers. I need to speak to the people who think the NYC subway is the center of the universe. We have this mythology that New York invented the chaotic underground urban transport system. It's gritty, it's loud, it's iconic. But I went to the London Transport Museum recently, which, by the way, is way more fun than it sounds, and I had to take a seat. The London Underground isn't just a little bit older than the New York subway. It is ancient. The first section of the London Underground opened in 1863. Let's put that into context. 1863. That is the middle of the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was president. We were fighting at Gettysburg with muskets and cannons, and meanwhile, Londoners were commuting to work on a train under the ground. And it gets crazier. These weren't electric trains. Electric trains hadn't been invented yet. These were steam trains. Just think about the psychology of that for a second. Victorian London was already smoggy and dark, and then some engineers said, hey, you know those massive steam engines that belch smoke and fire? Let's put them in a tiny tunnel and make people ride them in the dark. It sounds like a horror movie, and honestly, it kind of was. They had to leave vents open to let the smoke out, and people would come out of the tube covered in soot and coughing. They called it taking the sewer, but they did it because London traffic was so bad even in the 1860s that they had no choice. The New York subway didn't open until 1904. That's 41 years later. By the time New York swiped its first Metro card or bought its first token, London had been doing the underground thing for nearly half a century. The method they used was called cut and cover. They literally dug up the streets of London, laid the track, built a brick tunnel arch over it, and then put the road back on top. It was a massive civil engineering project that destroyed entire neighborhoods, but it created the concept of rapid urban transit. So while the NYC subway has the pizza rat and the Showtime dancers, the London Underground has the birthright. It is the grandfather of every subway system in the world. And honestly, the padded seats on the tube, still better than the plastic buckets in New York. Sorry, not sorry. 3. Stainless steel. Okay, let's talk about something we touch every single day. Look at your kitchen, look at your appliances, your cutlery, the sink. Stainless steel. It feels like a modern material, right? It feels like something that came out of the gleaming chrome-plated American era of the 1950s, the Chrysler Building, the diners, the Airstream trailers. Stainless just sounds like American marketing, but the story of stainless steel is actually a story about the British military and a guy from Sheffield. Sheffield is a city in the north of England that has been famous for steel since Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. It's Steel City. In 1913, there was a metallurgist named Harry Brearley. He wasn't trying to make a nice spoon, he was trying to solve a military problem. The British Army was having an issue where the barrels of their guns were eroding too quickly because of the heat and the friction of firing bullets. They needed a metal that could withstand the abuse. Brearley started experimenting with adding chromium to steel. He made a bunch of different mixtures, and as the story goes, he threw the failures into a scrap heap in the corner of the lab. A few weeks later, he walked past the scrap heap. He noticed that while all the other rusted scraps were brown and corroded, one piece was still shiny and bright. It hadn't rusted. He realized he had stumbled onto something massive. He called it rustless steel. Now here is the most British part of the story. He took it to the cutlery manufacturers in Sheffield, the guys making knives and forks, and they hated it. They said it was too hard to work with, it was too expensive, and the knives wouldn't be sharp enough. The cutlers of Sheffield actually considered him a nuisance. Brearley didn't give up. He proved that you could use it for vinegar-proof knives, which was a big deal apparently, and eventually it caught on, but he called it rustless steel. It was a marketing guy named Ernest Stewart who said, "Harry, rustless sounds boring. Let's call it stainless." So that gleaming American diner aesthetic, that shiny arch in St. Louis, it all comes from a scrap heap in Sheffield and a guy who just wanted to stop gun barrels from melting. 4. The vacuum cleaner. This one is a branding issue. In the UK, people often call vacuum cleaners hoovers. They treat it like a verb. I'm going to hoover the lounge. I always assumed this was because Hoover was an American company, which it is, and therefore Americans invented it. We think of the 1950s housewife with her pearls and her vacuum. It's the domestic American ideal. But the actual machine, the mechanism of sucking dust out of a carpet, that's British. Let's go back to 1901. There was an engineer named Hubert Cecil Booth. Before Booth, cleaning machines actually blew air. They would blast compressed air at the carpet to blow the dust away, which, if you think about it, is stupid because the dust just settles somewhere else. It didn't remove the dirt, it just rearranged it. Booth saw a demonstration of one of these blowing machines in London. He asked the inventor, "Why don't you suck the dust up?" The inventor told him that was impossible. Booth was the type of guy who didn't take impossible for an answer. The story is legendary. He went to a restaurant, put his handkerchief over the plush velvet seat of a chair, put his mouth on the handkerchief, and sucked as hard as he could. When he pulled the handkerchief away, there was a dark ring of dust on the cloth. He realized the dust was trapped. He had proven the concept of suction filtration. He built a machine called the Puffing Billy. But this wasn't a cute little Dyson you hang on the wall. This thing was a monster. It was a massive petrol-powered engine that had to be pulled by horses. He would park it on the street outside your house and run long hoses through your windows to clean the carpets. It was so loud that he kept getting sued for frightening the horses in the street, but it became a status symbol. If the Puffing Billy was parked outside your house, your neighbors knew you were rich enough to have your dust scientifically removed. He was even called to clean the carpets at Westminster Abbey before the coronation of Edward VII. So while Mr. Hoover, the American, was a savvy businessman who bought the patent for a smaller electric version later on, the actual physics of vacuuming was invented by a British guy sucking on a chair in a restaurant. 5. Television. This is the hill I used to be willing to die on. Television is Hollywood. It's RCA. It's NBC. It's American culture. We exported TV to the world. The idea that anyone else could have invented the TV felt ridiculous to me. But then I learnt about a Scotsman named John Logie Baird. In the US, we are taught about Philo Farnsworth, the Mormon farm boy who sketched the idea for electronic TV. And yes, Farnsworth is important for electronic TV. But the first person to actually transmit a moving grayscale image, that was Baird. In 1925, in a laboratory in London, which was basically an attic, Baird used a system of spinning discs, bicycle lamps, and scanning nippers to transmit the image of a ventriloquist's dummy named Stooky Bill. He was so excited that he ran downstairs, grabbed a 20-year-old office boy named William Taitnan, and forced him to sit in front of the camera so he could be the first human face on TV. Poor William was terrified because the lights were so hot, but he made history. Baird wasn't just tinkering. In 1928, he achieved the first transatlantic television transmission. He sent a signal from London to New York. In the 1920s, and the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, started the world's first regular high-definition television service in 1936. They were broadcasting from Alexandra Palace in London. They had announcers, they had plays, they had cartoons. Americans didn't really get regular TV broadcasts until the 1939 World's Fair in New York. By that time, the British had been watching TV for 3 years. There is actually a funny, sad story about this. When we started in 1939, the BBC had to shut down the TV service abruptly because they were worried the radio waves would act as a homing beacon for German bombers. The story goes that they were in the middle of a Mickey Mouse cartoon. They just cut the feed. When the war ended and they turned the transmitters back on in 1946, the announcer famously said, "Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bligh?" And then they played the same Mickey Mouse cartoon from the exact point where it cut off 7 years earlier. That level of continuity, that is so British. But yeah, the box is a British invention. 6. Time zones, GMT. This one is less of a gadget and more of a concept that rules our entire lives. Growing up in the US, we have Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. It feels like a fact of nature. We just assume that time is standardized because, well, how else would the world work? But until the mid-19th century, time was local. If it was noon in London, it was 12:02 in Reading and 12:05 in Bristol. Every town set their clocks by the sun. This was fine when you were traveling by horse, because you moved so slowly that the time difference didn't matter. But remember the trains? When the British invented the passenger railway, suddenly you could travel fast enough that these time differences became a nightmare. If you tried to print a train schedule, it was impossible. You'd arrive before you left. It was chaos. So the Great Western Railway introduced railway time in 1840. They forced all their stations to use the time in London, Greenwich Mean Time. Eventually, this expanded to the whole world. In 1884, there was an International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. Ironically, they had to decide where the prime meridian, the zero line of longitude, would be. Because Britain was the maritime superpower and had already mapped most of the world's oceans, and because 72% of the world's commerce already used sea charts based on Greenwich, the world voted to make Greenwich, London, the center of time. So every time you look at your phone and it sets itself automatically, or you schedule a Zoom call with someone in a different time zone, you are using a system designed by Victorian railway clerks to stop trains from crashing. We are literally living on British time. 7. Table tennis, ping pong. I always thought ping pong was either Chinese, because they dominate the sport now, or American, because it feels like a basement rec room game. It has that we were bored in the garage energy. But no, table tennis is the result of upper-class Victorian boredom. In the 1880s, British Army officers in India and wealthy families in England wanted to play tennis. But sometimes it was raining because England, or it was too hot outside. So they brought the game indoors. They didn't have equipment, so they improvised. They used a line of books as the net. They used cigar box lids as the rackets. And for the ball, they used rounded corks from champagne bottles. I mean, can you get more aristocratic than that? Jeeves, pass me the champagne cork. I wish to play a round of whiff-waff. And that's what they called it. whiff waff, or flim flam, or gossamer. It wasn't until later that a British manufacturer started making celluloid balls that made a ping and pong sound when they hit the table. An English company called J. Jacques and Son Limited registered the name Ping Pong in 1901. Later, they sold the rights to the Parker brothers in the US, and that's when it became an American basement staple. But the origins? It's literally rich people playing with their garbage after a dinner party. 8. Portland cement, concrete. This is the most boring sounding one, but it is actually the most important. Look at any American city, the sidewalks, the highways, the foundations of the skyscrapers, the dams. Concrete is the skeleton of the modern world. We tend to think of concrete as Roman, which is true, the Romans had it, but the technology was lost for centuries. The formula disappeared. For over 1,000 years, people were just stacking bricks with weak mortar. The modern concrete that built America, Portland cement, was invented by a bricklayer from Leeds named Joseph Aspdin in 1824. He experimented in his kitchen again with the kitchen science by burning powdered limestone and clay in his stove. He realized that if you burnt it at insanely high temperatures, it created a clinker that, when ground up and mixed with water, hardened into stone. He called it Portland cement, not because it was from Portland, Oregon, which didn't really exist yet, or Portland, Maine. He named it that because when it dried, it looked like Portland stone, which was a high-quality building stone quarried on the Isle of Portland in Dorset, England. It was a marketing trick. Look, my grey sludge turns into fancy stone. Without Joseph Aspdin, there is no Hoover Dam. There is no interstate highway system. There is no concrete jungle in New York. The very ground we walk on in America is held together by a British recipe. 9. The toothbrush. Okay, this one is funny to me because of the stereotype. You know the one. Americans have perfect, blindingly white, straight teeth. The British have, well, character. We make fun of British teeth constantly. It's a national pastime. So imagine the irony when I found out that the mass-produced toothbrush is a British invention, and the story is straight out of a movie. The year was 1780. A man named William Addis was sitting in a prison cell in Newgate Prison, London. He had been arrested for inciting a riot, which honestly, fair play. Back then, people cleaned their teeth by rubbing a rag with soot or salt on them. It was gross. Addis was sitting in his cell, looking at a broom in the corner, and he had an idea. He saved a bone from his dinner, presumably a nasty prison beef shank. He drilled small holes into the bone. Then he bribed a guard to get him some pig bristles, stiff hair from a pig. He glued the bristles into the bone. He spent his prison sentence perfecting his toothbrush. When he got out of jail, instead of going back to rioting, he started a business. He became incredibly wealthy. His company, Wisdom Toothbrushes, still exists in the UK today. So every time we Americans stand in front of the mirror, obsessively scrubbing our pearly whites with our high-tech sonic brushes, we are mimicking the actions of a bored British convict with a leftover bone. The irony is delicious. 10. The postage stamp. Finally, let's talk about mail. The US Postal Service. Benjamin Franklin was our first Postmaster General, so we feel a lot of ownership over the mail. We think of the Pony Express and the bald eagle logo. But the modern concept of the postal system, specifically the stamp, is British. Before 1840, sending a letter was a nightmare. It was expensive, and crucially, the recipient had to pay for it, not the sender. Imagine that. You'd get a letter, and the mailman would say, "That'll be $2. If you were poor, or if you just didn't want to talk to the person who wrote to you, you'd refuse to pay. The post office was losing a fortune carrying letters that nobody paid for. A British teacher named Rowland Hill proposed a radical idea: make the sender pay, make it cheap, 1 penny, and use a little sticky piece of paper to prove payment. In 1840, Britain issued the penny black. It was the world's first adhesive postage stamp. It featured the profile of Queen Victoria. Suddenly, people could send letters anywhere in the UK for a penny. It caused a communication revolution. It was like the 19th century version of WhatsApp. People started sending Christmas cards, Valentines, and business orders. And here is the ultimate flex. If you look at a stamp from France, it says France. A stamp from the US says USA. A stamp from Japan says Nippon. British stamps? They don't have the country name on them. They just have the profile of the monarch, the Queen, or now the king. Why? Because they invented it. They got there first, so they didn't need to clarify which country they were. Everyone else had to add their name to distinguish themselves from the original. That is the ultimate we did it first power move. So there you have it, 10 more things. My worldview is shattered, my American pride is slightly bruised, but my respect for this rainy little island has gone up another notch. It's becoming very clear to me that history is a group project. Britain usually does the initial research, writes the thesis, and builds the prototype in a shed. Then America comes in, creates a catchy logo, scales it up to 1 billion units, and sells it back to the world. We are the marketing department, they are the R&D department, and honestly, it's a pretty good partnership. But I will never ever forgive them for the fact that I've been calling it a lawn my whole life without realizing I owe it to a guy named Budding who was afraid of the dark. If you enjoyed this deep dive into my humility, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what's an invention you are convinced is American. I'll probably look it up and find out it was invented by a British plumber in 1642. I'm Olivia, signing off from London where it is currently raining, the trains are running underground, and I'm about to go use my British toothbrush. Cheers guys,